Secularization is the transformation of a society from close identification with religious values and institutions toward non-religious values and secular institutions. The secularization thesis refers to the belief that as societies progress, particularly through modernization and rationalization, religion loses its authority in all aspects of social life and governance. The term secularization is also used in the context of the lifting of the monastic restrictions from a member of the clergy. Secularization refers to the historical process in which religion loses social and cultural significance. As a result of secularization, the role of religion in modern societies becomes restricted. In secularized societies, faith lacks cultural authority, and religious organizations have little social power. Secularization has many levels of meaning, both as a theory and a historical process. Social theorists such as Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Max Weber, and Emil Durkheim postulated that the modernization of society would include a decline in levels of religiosity. Study of this process seeks to determine the manner in which, or extent to which religious creeds, practices and institutions are losing social significance. Some theorists argue that the secularization of modern civilization partly results from our inability to adapt broad ethical and spiritual needs of mankind to the increasingly fast advance of the physical sciences. The term also has additional meanings, primarily historical and religious. Applied to church property, historically it refers to the seizure of monastic lands and buildings, such as Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in England and the later acts during the French Revolution, as well as by various anti-clerical European governments during the 18th and 19th centuries, which resulted in the expulsion and suppression of the religious communities which occupied them. Otherwise, secularization involves the abandonment of goods by the church where it is sold to purchasers after the government seizes the property, which most commonly happens after reasonable negotiations and arrangements are made. Still another form of secularization refers to the act of prince-bishops or holders of a position in a monastic or military order, holding a combined religious and secular authority under the Catholic Church, who broke away and made themselves into completely secular hereditary rulers. For example, Gotthard von Ketteler, the last master of the Livonian order, converted to Lutheranism, secularized the lands of Semigalia and Courland which he had held on behalf of the order, which enabled him to marry and leave to his descendants the Duchy of Courland and Semigalia. In Catholic canon law, the term can also denote the permission or authorization given for a member of a religious order to live outside his or her religious community or monastery either for a fixed or permanent period. Background: secularization is sometimes credited both to the cultural shifts in society following the emergence of rationality and the development of science as a substitute for superstition. Max Weber called this process the disenchantment of the world, and to the changes made by religious institutions to compensate. At the most basic stages, this begins with a slow transition from oral traditions to a writing culture that diffuses knowledge. This first reduces the authority of clerics as the custodians of revealed knowledge. As the responsibility for education has moved from the family and community to the state, two consequences have arisen: collective conscience as defined by Durkheim is diminished, fragmentation of communal activities leads to religion becoming more a matter of individual choice rather than an observed social obligation. A major issue in the study of secularization is the extent to which certain trends such as decreased attendance at places of worship indicate a decrease in religiosity or simply a privatization of religious belief, where religious beliefs no longer play a dominant role in public life or in other aspects of decision-making. The issue of secularization is discussed in various religious traditions. The government of Turkey is an often cited example, following the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate and foundation of the Turkish Republic in 1923. This established popular sovereignty in a secular republican framework, in opposition to a system whose authority is based on religion. As one of many examples of state modernization, this shows secularization and democratization as mutually reinforcing processes, relying on a separation of religion and state. In expressly secular states like India, it has been argued that the need was to legislate for toleration and respect between quite different religions, and likewise, The secularization of the West was a response to drastically violent intra-Christian feuds between Catholicism and Protestantism. Some have therefore argued that Western and Indian secularization is radically different in that it deals with autonomy from religious regulation and control. Considerations of both tolerance and autonomy are relevant to any secular state. Definitions: John Somerville outlines 6 uses of the term secularization in the scientific literature. The first 5 are more along the lines of definitions, while the 6th is more of a clarification of use. When discussing macro-social structures, secularization can refer to differentiation, a process in which the various aspects of society, economic, political, legal, and moral, become increasingly specialized and distinct from one another. When discussing individual institutions, secularization can denote the transformation of a religious into a secular institution. Examples would be the evolution of institutions such as Harvard University from a predominantly religious institution into a secular institution. When discussing activities, secularization refers to the transfer of activities from religious to secular institutions, such as a shift in provision of social services from churches to the government. When discussing mentalities, secularization refers to the transition from ultimate concerns to proximate concerns. For example, individuals in the West are now more likely to moderate their behavior in response to more immediately applicable consequences rather than out of concern for post-mortem consequences. This is a personal religious decline or movement toward a secular lifestyle. When discussing populations, secularization refers to broad patterns of societal decline in levels of religiosity as opposed to the individual level secularization of above. This understanding of secularization is also distinct from above in that it refers specifically to religious decline rather than societal differentiation. When discussing religion, secularization can only be used unambiguously to refer to religion in a generic sense. For example, a reference to Christianity is not clear unless one specifies exactly which denominations of Christianity are being discussed. Abdel-Wahab al-Masri outlined 2 meanings of the secularization term: partial secularization, which is the common meaning of the word, and expresses the separation between religion and state. Complete secularization, this definition is not limited to the partial definition, but exceeds it to the separation between all values, but also to, so that the holiness is removed from the world, and this world is transformed into a usable matter that can be employed for the sake of the strong. Sociological use and differentiation, as studied by sociologists, one of the major themes of secularization is that of differentiation, that is, the tendency for areas of life to become more distinct and specialized as a society becomes modernized. European sociology, influenced by anthropology, was interested in the process of change from the so-called primitive societies to increasingly advanced societies. In the United States, the emphasis was initially on change as an aspect of progress, but Talsott Parsons refocused on society as a system immersed in a constant process of increased differentiation, which he saw as a process in which new institutions take over the tasks necessary in a society to guarantee its survival as the original monolithic institutions break up. This is a devolution from single, less differentiated institutions to an increasingly differentiated subset of institutions. Following Parsons, this concept of differentiation has been widely applied. As phrased by José Casanova, this core and the central thesis of the theory of secularization is the conceptualization of the process of societal modernization as a process of functional differentiation and emancipation of the secular sphere, primarily the state, the economy, and science from the religious sphere, and the concomitant differentiation and specialization of religion within its own newly found religious sphere. Casanova also describes this as the theory of privatization of religion, which he partially criticizes. While criticizing certain aspects of the traditional sociological theory of secularization, however, David Martin argues that the concept of social differentiation has been its most useful element. Institutional secularization. In most Western countries, government, non-profits, and the private sector have taken over the provision of social welfare, but in Germany, secularization has not occurred to the same degree. there are still about 100,000 church-based charitable foundations providing services from preschool education to healthcare for the elderly, making the two major churches the second largest employers after government. This is funded partly by the churches out of their own revenues, with the balance coming from general tax revenue. Critics argue that by allowing the churches to play such a major role, the state is breaching its duty of neutrality under Article 4 of the Grundgesetz, and they consider it inappropriate for heavy subsidies to be given to the churches. On their part, the churches see this work as a natural part of their Christian mission. Current issues in secularization. At present, secularization is understood in the West as being debated in the sociology of religion. In his works Legitimacy of the Modern Age and the Genesis of the Copernican World, Hans Blumenberg has rejected the idea of a historical continuity, fundamental the so-called theorem of secularization. The modern age in his view represents an independent epoch opposed to antiquity and the Middle Ages by a rehabilitation of human curiosity in reaction to theological absolutism. Blumenberg targets La Paragraphe with his argument that progress is the secularization of Hebrew and Christian beliefs and argues to the contrary that the modern age, including its belief in progress, grew out of a new secular self-affirmation of culture against the Christian tradition. Wolfhart Pannenberg, a student of La Paragraphe, has continued the debate against Blumenberg. Charles Taylor in A Secular Age challenges what he calls the subtraction thesis that science leads to religion being subtracted from more and more areas of life. Proponents of secularization theory demonstrate widespread declines in the prevalence of religious belief throughout the West, particularly in Europe. Some scholars have argued that levels of religiosity are not declining, while other scholars have countered by introducing the idea of neo-secularization, which broadens the definition of secularization to include the decline of religious authority and its ability to influence society. In other words, rather than using the proportion of irreligious apostates as the sole measure of secularity, neo-secularization argues that individuals increasingly look outside of religion for authoritative positions. Neo-secularizationist would argue that religion has diminishing authority on issues such as birth control, and argue that religion's authority is declining and secularization is taking place even if religious affiliation may not be declining in the United States. Finally, some claim that demographic forces offset the process of secularization, and may do so to such an extent that individuals can consistently drift away from religion even as society becomes more religious. This is especially the case in societies like Israel where committed religious groups have several times the birth rate of seculars. The religious fertility effect operates to a greater or lesser extent in all countries, and is amplified in the West by religious immigration. For instance, even as native whites became more secular, London, England, has become more religious in the past 25 years as religious immigrants and their descendants have increased their share of the population. See also. References. External links, definition of secularization at geertmsaunders.co.uk, secularization theory, the course of a concept. Further reading, Berger, Peter. The Sacred Canopy. Berger, Peter. The Desecularization of the World. Bruce, Steve. Religion in the Modern World, From Cathedrals to Cults, Bruce, Steve. God is Dead, Secularization in the West. Casanova, Jose. Public Religions in the Modern World. Chaves, M. Secularization as Declining Religious Authority. Social Forces 72, 3, 749 €74. Eliel, Jack. The New Demons. Gaucher, Marcel. The Disenchantment of the World. Martin, David. A General Theory of Secularization. New York, Harper and Row, Somerville, C.J. Secular Society Religious Population, Are Tacit Rules for Using the Term Secularization. Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion 37 249 €53. Said, E. Orientalism, Western Conceptions of the Orient. London, Penguin, Skolnick, Jonathan and Peter Eli Gordon, eds., New German Critique 94 Special Issue on Secularization and Disenchantment, Stark, Rodney, Lawrence Arayanakan, Monica Terzi, and Marco Zecchi. How much has Europe been secularized? Inch Easter 32, 136, 99 Euro 112. Taylor, Charles. A Secular Age. Harvard University Press. Warrior, Maya. Processes of Secularization in Contemporary India, Guru Faith in the Martyr Amritanandamayi Mission, Modern Asian Studies, Abdul Wahab al-Masri, Dar al-Shawrock, The Partial Secularization and the Complete Secularization, OOMO to the first UUOM USO copyright OOMO squared O show copyright UOMO to the first UUOM USO copyright OOMO OOM UO copyright